Thank you very much. Presentation should just be coming up. And I'm going to start just by making a link between yesterday and today. I'm not sure how many people were here yesterday, but the title of this session is Making Relationships Count. I will keep my eye on the chat for any questions or comments, but I will also pause at various points and hopefully entice you into a conversation either via the chat or by putting a hand up. So we'll see how the pregnant pause go. Making relationships count. I ended yesterday's session with a salutary tale. We spoke yesterday about systems thinking, about systems modeling. My sort of background, 30 odd years as a strategist, as a modeler, is quite analytical. I'm not a trained analyst or a trained programmer, but I'm a bit of a numbers geek, and I therefore like to be able to work through strategy and do my modeling. However, the salutary tale was that we did a stonking piece of work about 15 years ago, so it's well in history and it doesn't matter who it is, although I won't reveal it, which was primarily about strategy for and capacity in community hospitals. And we left the report, and I remember saying to my colleague as we left the system, I said, that's a great report, but I'm not sure they'll be able to implement it because they're at each other's necks. They just don't get on. And we walked away, and it's disappointing in some ways because, you know, they're spending good NHS money, and they've got a good report and they've got some actions to take, and you're not absolutely confident that it'll do the job. About 6 years later, somebody from another system who we'd worked with landed in this first system with community hospitals and gave me a ring. And she said, Peter, we've got an issue that we wondered whether you could look at. It's about community hospitals. And I stopped her and I said, let me tell you what the problem is. I don't think anything will have changed. And she said, no, nothing's changed. So relationships matter. And for all of our, whether it's project planning, whether it's writing strategies, whether it's having the best idea since sliced bread in terms of how things should work, if you haven't got the basis of a good set of relationships and partnership working, absolutely critical at the moment with ICBs. I mean, integration has been the name of the game for many years. ICBs is the latest iteration. Whether they're working or not, I'll leave you to judge whether the jury is still out, and we're currently working with two and have worked with a number of ICBs where recognizing the complexity and the challenges of building relationships and the journey from through COVID into a new world has not been without its challenges. And this today hopefully will give you some fuel for thought in terms of why relationships matter and how we can get the measure of them. Because I'm now applying both my systems and my quantitative thinking to something that is normally sense, well, you know, relationships are a mushy thing. How do we actually understand and manage them? So I'm going to try and do three things. I'm going to frame the concept, a conceptual framing, if you like, of relationships within a system. And that's the key sort of distinguishing factor, I suppose, that this is about the relationships within a system. I will then describe the relational value framework that we've developed and applied in a number of settings, and then I'll show you some examples and learning, and hopefully with pregnant pauses or key questions, that will be helpful. I'm looking at some of the comments there. So our starting point. So technical solutions in health and care settings dominate, and I don't know whether if I asked you sort of on a scale 0 to 10 what the balance was between technical transactional arrangements within ICBs and other organizations, sort of on balance, do they dominate against the more relational improvement sort of technologies? Then you can take your choice, but I would suggest that those technical solutions are dominant. But they do have the tendency to sub-optimize well-being outcomes, particularly when needs are complex and cure is not the dominant modus operandi. It's fairly self-evident. The other sort of downside, if you like, of technical solutions is that they can often devalue professional roles and expertise. And it's not that they're not valuable, it's that we sometimes lean towards the technical rather than the relational, and we need a balance. It's consistent. Joe Stanford did a piece on neuroscience 2 days ago, and another dimension of neuroscience is how we make decisions. And we make decisions, according to the brain surgeons or the neurologists, by a balance of left and right, the intuitive and the rational. And it's that sort of balance that I'm looking for in terms of systems thinking and systems application, where relationships are important. I mentioned the systems perspective, and yesterday I introduced a causal loop diagram. So maybe this is familiar from yesterday, maybe it's familiar otherwise, but the sort of way in which we sometimes devise or describe reinforcing cycles, rings of doom, if you like, in terms of how we operate. And wherever you tell the story on this, there is a downward spiral that can challenge the way in which we run our systems. I'll start it here. Pressure on the system, where we've got pressure on the system all around us. And if the pressure on the system grows, then you could argue that the quality of relationships reduces, performance reduces, leadership then increases, leadership changes increase, which puts more pressure on the system. And I've just described a story. There are ways out of that vicious cycle. And some of those are sometimes performance driven. Sometimes they're in sticking with a leader. Sometimes they're in reducing pressure on the system. But what I want to suggest today is that a focus on the quality of relationships can actually help you to turn a negative reinforcing cycle into a positive one. Because the beauty of these sort of conceptualizations, if you like, is that they can turn to be virtuous. And if you can improve relationships, and therefore improve performance and reduce the turnover in leadership and therefore reduce pressure on the system, that is the perfect world, if you like. But it's the quality of relationships that we're focusing on rather than the performance, although one follows the other, I would suggest. Just looking over there, technical solution helps people avoid the more difficult changes in self and thoughts, perhaps. Okay, thank you for those thoughts. Do keep your eye on those comments as they come through. So the theoretical frame that I came to this from a background in strategy and I suppose more quantitative approaches was that the human factor is not a simple extension of the technical sphere, but is part of the starting frame of reference, that balance between the human and the technical relationship. Relationships also are more than simple connectedness. There are tools and approaches out there that can map your networks, can identify significant points of inflection or of influence. But what I'm suggesting in what I present today is that there's real substance in the relationships themselves. And we've developed the framework, which I'll come back to, concept of relational value, which is all the things that we recognize often in a system in terms of integrity, respect, fairness, compassion, and trust. And those have come from a thinking around a philosophical framework that can help us to respect and work with the human dimension. We're also recognizing, however, that it's not only difficult to measure, but also difficult to directly impact on those things. So what I've described there as a socio-technical framework recognizes that the way in which you implement some of those values and behaviors is through the people, the culture, the vision, the process, and the infrastructure or technology. And those are all things that you can operate on, if you like. You can improve processes, you can develop a vision, you can ensure that vision is widely owned, you can implement technology that will ease the communication within a system. They're all things that you can operate on, but in a good sort of management sort of framework, matrix framework, then operating, if you like, in the vertical of those socio-technical framework elements, then affects the quality of the attributes that come to make up the relational value within a system. So we believe that an understanding of that human system within that context requires us to recognize distinct and responsible actors that join to achieve a common purpose. So the purpose for which you come together, the outcomes that you want to see are critical to understanding the context in which you work in terms of relationships. So if there's a big idea, then it is that the quality of relationships is influenced by and is integral to the system of care, and therefore that there are no purely technical solutions. I remember presenting on this alongside somebody who was bringing into play a piece of bedside technology for an acute hospital that was improving recognition and planning for a particular patient. And they described a long process of engagement and gaining buy-in, I suppose, from professionals of all sorts within the system. And we're emphasizing throughout the human dimension of implementing this technical solution. And at the end of their talk, the first person to put their hands up, having received that talk, said, "Can we buy it off the shelf?" They didn't use that language, but they'd completely ignored the fact that this was a process of implementation and winning hearts and minds, and not purely a technical solution. We also believe that we can measure the quality of relationships through our experience and an evidence-based set of behaviours. So our initial work around the relational value framework was done through a knowledge transfer partnership with Leeds University in 2014-15. It was rooted in practice in an extra care housing setting, actually, and went through that evidence-based approach to see what actually made a difference in terms of behaviours. And you'll see behaviours being a critical part of what we're describing, and that therefore we can ultimately evidence the value of relationships in terms of well-being and outcomes. We also recognise that there's a systems within systems approach, that the context, culture and behaviours of system leaders are influential in delivering improved outcomes for patients. And that's where our work as a strategy consultancy, I suppose, not necessarily at the coalface, although we've done some team assessments of relational value, but it's actually setting that culture and those values and modelling behaviours that ultimately improves outcomes for patients, clients and the wider population. Our research backbone, I've mentioned the knowledge transfer partnerships 2015-16. We framed the research through observational theoretical reflection, did a literature review, we used an extra care setting, and we embedded the relational value paradigm in an ongoing culture and practice of the unit. And those are written up in a couple of papers that I should really have included in a reference, but I can attend to that later with HPCA. Some selected research findings. Relationships are good for your health. It's a sort of obvious statement, and there's plenty out there. You could probably end up with dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of references, but there are just 3 there that were identified in our research. And the system dimension to that was also important in terms of what we wanted to demonstrate. Things like community-based countries showing increased life expectancy. You're not necessarily talking cause and effect, but there's a correlation there, and the association between social integration and mortality. So there are a couple of research papers there that gave us confidence to move on from the work that we were doing, and to come up with a concept. And I'll pause here and see what comments there might be. You might want to prepare a comment or a question from that first sort of section of input. But I've got a statement here of what is relational value, and I've described it as that which is in between people, if you like, within a system. RV is the lifeblood of a healthy system, organisation, partnership or team of people. It's the medium through which our communication and connections pass, and that either enhances or distorts our ability to achieve a common purpose. So for these purposes, that is what I'm describing as relational value. It's something that we can, as we'll go on and demonstrate, that you can observe, count and get the measure of. So I'm just going to see whether there's any sort of either comments or hands up moments for people after that first bit of input. Anybody want to come in? Sounds like the lunch is too good. So insights and questions. I will move on. I'll catch up with any comments. If people are writing away and it's yet to appear in my chat, I'll pause. So we wanted to translate that theoretical framing, if you like, and conceptual thinking into a practical tool. It's a tool that now sort of goes along with us when we're doing my salutary tale at the start. If we are doing a strategic review, a demand and capacity piece of work, we will very often now do a relational value audit in order that people are left with challenges in terms of working together and partnership development to deliver the changes that are envisaged. And that's now a common feature of our work. But what does that tool look like? So the tool demonstrates that we can evidence the benefit of relational value. It can assess or measure the extent to which attributes of relational value are present. It builds on the fact that we believe that you can then influence those behaviors and therefore influence the quality of relationships and outcomes. And that there are, in addition, prior conditions relevant to the attributes of relational value, which may be outside our control, but can have significant impact. So it's a way of looking into a mirror, if you like, in terms of what the quality of relationships are within a system, recognizing what's come before. And the relational paradigm shift is about understanding that relationships are more than just connectedness. They are a resource. That's why we call it relational value, recognizable attributes based on an evidence-based approach. So for our purposes, a relationship is something that exists between two individuals, groups, or organizations. It has a purpose. There are the attributes that I've mentioned, and that they can be enhanced or denuded through behaviors that have been evidenced to result in certain outcomes. And it's these things that we're looking at in terms of understanding the importance of relationships. There's a comment here from Steph, examples of situations where our working relationships are not what we would have hoped, but wish to forge them. So
sorry, I meant forget. Sorry, forget.
Forget. Oh, yes.
I think I was just thinking, sometimes it's, can actually be almost a bit painful to think about, some relationship, some situations or some roles that you've had where the working relationships weren't what you would have hoped, and to sort of talk about them. But, then I do strongly remember some really great working relationships where it was so great that it was actually difficult to move on, even though you wanted promotion or progress. So it's that kind of difficult one, isn't it? So
so the quality of relationships there are a factor in your case, retention or moving on or whatever. And I think sometimes recognizing the value of relationships in terms of staff well-being. We want people to work in a system where they are valued, where there is trust, where there is progress and resilience. The relational dimension speaks to the concept of resilience as well. So that's very helpful, Steph. Thank you. The framework that we've developed, I've mentioned this briefly already, the 5 attributes of relational value and the domains of a socio-technical framework produces this sort of 5x6 framework. And I've just got a few examples here that you might want to reflect on. If you were asked, so in your current work situation, do your own little poll here. If you were asked the extent to which your own views about what the future looks like are respected and included, would you say that that's on a scale of 0 to 10 or whatever scale you want to use? Do you feel that that's where you're at the moment in your system, in your team, in your organization? Are your views about what the future looks like respected and included? You should have sort of smiley faces or polls or whatever. Or secondly, I have equal opportunity to access key people in the partnership. Oh, there's a good laughing face there. So I think that's a sort of low score, and a few thumbs up. So there's a mix of views there. So if I were to say I have equal opportunity to access key people in the partnership, what would your response there be? Scale of 0 to 10. We ask the question, we give people 6 options that these statements are true. Observed behaviors consistent with these statements are consistently not present, rarely present, sometimes present, often present, mostly present, or consistently present. And if you know anything about sort of scoring, then it's good to have 6 so that there isn't a middle one. Although in the recent work that we've been doing, people tend to sort of gravitate towards the sometimes, which we then use as a benchmark. Because if we see a statement and 50 people have responded to it, and most of them are saying, well, it's often or mostly, then that's fine. But if most people are saying sometimes, I have to ask the question whether these important behaviors consistent with quality relationships are only sometimes present. Then is that really enough to build a high performing organization? And I'd say no. So if we were scoring that, and we give rarely 1, sometimes 2, etc., then anything below 2 is disastrous and undermines the nature of relationships. So the extent to which people think these statements are true, and in particular whether there is consensus about this, and I'll come back to that, will tell us something about the amount of and the health of the relational value within an organization or system. So, yeah. Okay, there's a question there, Cara. If a relationship is only sometimes present, is it even a relationship? So the important thing there is that what we're asking is whether the behaviors consistent with the statement are consistently true. And you will, within an organization, a team or system, you'll come into contact with lots of different people. And what you want to know is have a consistency of, and it comes back to culture to some degree, but other things as well, underpinnings. Does the process always work? Does the technology always work? Is it a consistent set of behaviors within the and you're right, if you could argue that if relational value is off the bottom, then you say, well, there really isn't a relationship. Relationship is very low. So I'd agree there's some insight there. Provide a collaborative. Yeah. Yeah, so I think, Mark, your comment there suggests how we need to rethink the importance of relationships post-COVID in our hybrid world. And it's not just about the coffee, the water cooler moment, but it's about the way in which we meet, the conversations we have, and the frequency. There are other tools in the relational sort of sphere, if you like, that describe the preconditions for relationships, and regular meetings. Even we know that we don't need meetings for meeting's sake, but actually they often spark opportunity to develop the behaviors that are important. So that's important. Yep, I'll come back to Faith, your comment about the respect domain. I think the next slide just unwraps something a little bit in terms of what we mean by each of the 5 attributes. Could the COVID effect have had an effect on relationships? Absolutely. That's probably the subject of a much longer conversation. So getting lots of insights and comments there. So keep them flowing, and I'll leave this slide up because it does unwrap a little bit and helps you think about what good looks like. I've described already something we measure these in terms of the observed behaviors, and that's a legitimate process. It's not sort of rocket science, and it's not sort of giving you the answer. But we do also need to ask the question about what good looks like. What's the nature of the relationship? What's the purpose of the relationship? And what's the context within which those relationships are occurring? So asking what does good look like? I've hinted at it by saying that any system that is predominantly exhibiting behaviors that are sometimes true, if those behaviors are important to achieving your partnership objective, then that's not good enough. They need to be often or even consistently true. But there is a question about what's the purpose of the system team relationship that you're in. And I'll use extreme examples in that the extent of respect, fairness, empathy, and trust that you want in a lifelong partnership, whether it be marriage or otherwise, will be different to the extent of respect, fairness, empathy, and trust that you expect in a business relationship or in a professional relationship, etc. So you go home from work, and you can hopefully leave some of those issues behind. So there is a question, I think, in the land of ICBs again, where you're working across organizations, you have to balance the priorities and the objectives of your organization as well as the system. And we like to talk about putting the patient, the client, the health and well-being of our population at the center. And it's sometimes sort of standing back and saying, well, actually, this is what is important before going further. So I'm just bringing people together, having a clear vision is not easy. And it is that sort of, my own view is that sometimes it's standing back, recognizing, I've mentioned already, systems within systems, our high level partnership objectives about the health of our population is master, if you like, to the subservient objectives of our organization, which is to ensure whatever it is, efficient hospital pathways, community services, social care assessments, etc. But that's all about putting the conversation about relationships into context and asking the question, what does good look like, which may be different in different circumstances. So integrity, what do we mean by integrity? How things connect and run, and whether they do that consistently. And I've just put a suggestion there as to what good might look like. The purpose of the system is understood by all. There are clear boundaries and genuine common purpose and pulling together. And I've repeated that down the 5 attributes, which is just an illustration of how we need to contextualize this sort of intervention. Respect, how we treat each other. Fairness, how equity is achieved. Empathy, how we understand each other. And trust, how much we put ourselves in each other's hands, if you like. How much do we trust all sorts of behaviors? How much do we give permission, if you like, within some systems to act on our behalf? So that's been the development of the tool itself. I've got the next slide is insights and questions, of which there have been several coming through before I move on to some worked examples. The RB attributes I've hinted already. They reflect I suppose a philosophical framing that each of these 5 are important in human relationships. There are other relationships that are more transactional, such as whether it's about the finances or the geography or whatever, and it links to some thinking of around whether we frame our relationships suboptimally, if you like, and not reflecting the human dimension. I could say more, probably not the place now, but it's useful comment there. The impact of language on the perception of trust in the early days. Wrong choice of word or phrase. This really is important in terms of alignment of language, and it's true within our strategy development, our systems modeling, as well as in our understanding of relationships, that those words are really important. So yes, thank you. Okay, so a few examples, and then we'll leave open again for Q&A and any other comments. So relational audits. So this is the sort of thing that we've done. I put a slide here with 3 different examples, and this is very high level. The fun starts when you sort of unwrap it and think about different sectors within a survey, and I might come back to that because it's fresh in my mind with the system that we're working in at the moment. But these, the blue, the orange, and the grey pillars here, columns, are 3 separate relational audits. The blue column is an academic industry partnership seeking to promote the uptake of modelling and simulation in healthcare. It was done many years ago. And you'll see there's a sort of fairly sort of 2.5 to 3 scoring across there. I'll come back to the blue because, as you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner, the devil was in the detail. The orange column was a health and social care partnership seeking to develop greater integration of service for older people. This was a classic sort of engagement process, and you'll see there where there was an area of concern in terms of the behaviours consistent with empathy and trust. And when you then turn that on its side using the framework, we were able then to identify which domain of the socio-technical framework was dragging those scores down and suggest some practical solutions to exactly how they might address that and improve those attributes. The grey column, small consultancy group working to advise health and social care partners, and there's a slight sort of gap there. We identified that there was, I suppose, the higher level fairness, empathy, trust was very strong, but we didn't have some of the processes and consistency in terms of what we did. And so that led to action using the same framework. So you can get very different outputs, very different scores. This is the devil in the detail in terms of that academic and industry partnership. And what you see here is dissonance. So the chart, the axis on the left-hand side shows the average difference in score. And when you consider that the score was at 0 to 5, then actually a difference of 1 is quite significant. People don't tend to be at the extremes anyway. And when we looked at those 2 parties, the difference between them in the domain, in the attribute, of respect, was quite significant. And it was particularly significant, well, it was significant across 5 out of the 6 domains of the socio-technical framework. And again, we were therefore able to be transparent about the nature of the relationship and take action to address some of those. So that was a factor. There was also a consistent message. If you look horizontally, the grey bars, where I've arrowed to the top, there was a consistent message of difference as to whether we had the right people to achieve our joint goals. So that was difference. One group thought that we did, the other group didn't, and that dissonance was harming the ability to achieve our overall goal. Although people in both groups appeared to be broadly agreed on the contribution that process and technology played. So we were able to diagnose, if you like, the quality of the relationship and the effectiveness of that partnership to achieve its goals and set some actions in place through what is a sort of pseudo or quantified getting the measure of relationships. We also worked with CQC.
Sorry, Peter.
Yes.
Can I interrupt you? I'm really sorry. Your previous slide, I was a bit confused. I can't actually. Could you just talk through it one more time?
Yes, I will.
I can't actually. I'm not clear on what I'm looking at.
Okay, so I'll go back 2 slides. So the blue bars there are the scores for the 5 attributes, of relational value in a partnership arrangement between an academic group and an industry group. Okay, and they don't shout out at you as being hugely sort of significant. You know, what do you do with those? It's fairly sort of consistent. So what we did was that we segmented the data because we asked the basic demographic information, and we said, well, okay, is there a difference of view between those 2 partners who have a common purpose? And you can reflect on this in other contexts. If we're working in an integrated way, we come from different organizations to achieve a common purpose. even though we have our own organizational objectives. And when we did that and we compared the scores for the two partners, we got difference. And the difference presented a pattern that enabled us to take some action. So what you're looking on here is the difference when you split the score in two and say, well, actually, if you had on this slide, those blue bars are actually an average of two very different scores. And the conversation about different perceptions of the relationship generated the action. Does that help? I've said it slightly differently, hopefully, in order to help.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Faith. Yeah. So CQC, we worked with CQC as part of their Beyond Barriers work, which was 2017-18, I think it was discharged from hospital. They were asked to do what was less inspectorial and more developmental, which was an interesting experiment for them and for the system. And the quality of relationships within a number of systems who were finding challenges on delayed discharges were one of their lines of inquiry was the quality of relationships. Only one of half a dozen different lines of inquiry, and we used the relational audit tool in each of those systems. We generated over 20 systems involved. We generated over 2,000 responses. And we explored the different ways of triangulating that data with the other lines of inquiry that were coming through and got some consistent, helpful, complementary views and perceptions of what it would take for each of those systems to improve. There were limitations. It can be sometimes difficult in terms of the busyness of the review. There were lots of other data requests going on. Though we went out to 20 systems, only 10 or 12 sites had sufficient sites to warrant statistical analysis. But we worked with that. We recognized that all 20 were already of a type, if you like, in that they had challenges of which probably quality of relationships was one of the casualties. So that was relevant. We analyzed that data. So Beyond Barriers, if you Google that, you should find it on CQC, and there's an appendix to the main document that covers the relational value work specifically. So if you're interested, you might want to find that. But we supported them in those lines of inquiries, and in one system, and I've just picked out one system here to demonstrate. We sent the tool out to the survey out to 22 individuals. That cascaded. We left it open for 2 weeks, relatively short period, reinforced it, reminded people, and we got 42 responses and 21 additional, that's free text comments, not fear text comments. And just to illustrate the breadth of the involvement on the left-hand side there, you can see it all the way through health commissioner, health provider, social care commissioner, all the people that you'd expect to be in a system with the objective of improving the flow of patients out of hospital. Then we also split the data by primary role in the system, and we asked the statements. We framed those. So what we often do, this is the matrix. This is one example of the statements that we would be asking people to say the extent to which they observe these behaviors being consistently practiced within that system. And we often tweak the phrase, that we don't change the meaning, but we change the context within which they're being delivered. And then we can visualize, as well as the examples earlier, we can visualize that, excuse me, into a standard radar plot, which might be helpful for some people. You can see the yellow of the infrastructure standing out a little bit there, and particularly in terms of the empathy, and you'd look back and see, well, what statement does that point on the radar graph represent, and how is that helpful? And on the other hand, you can go to that purple, the process and empathy. You say, well, that's a bit concerning. Let's pinpoint that. Let's think about the actions that we can take to improve the behaviors consistent with good quality relationships. We present the data back in just a simple table form. And the work that I'm doing at the moment with a client is not only identifying the high and the low scores, but also where there is dissonance in the response, which is the illustration that I used earlier. And Faith asked me to sort of clarify, because that's where you can have a score. It might look very average, but when you go under the surface and you look at those different segments, and in this case, there's a whole range of health and social care providers and organizations, where is it that there is difference in the perception of these, and what does that mean in terms of actions to be taken? Thank you. The Beyond Barriers is in the chat. Very helpful. Yes, the higher the better. That is right. They relate to those 6 categories. So we apply very simple scoring. If the observed behaviour, if somebody responds that the observed behaviour is not present at all, it scores 0. But then if it's rarely present, it's 1, sometimes 2, often 3, mostly 4, and consistently 5. So if everybody said that a particular behaviour was consistently present, then it would score 5. So hopefully that explains. Aim of SNAP, yeah. There's multi-layered here in terms of how you can turn this into 3-dimensional, but that would be beyond my wit at the moment. We can also draw out. Is there a
sorry, Peter, to interrupt you? Sorry, I know we said questions at the end, but there was one question there about where can the tool be accessed, and it was Marion who was asking, and does one need training to use the tool? Obviously, the slides are going to be shared afterwards, so people will be able to see the matrix questions.
Yeah, and my email is the back, so I suppose for now I'll just leave it as pop me an email. We can have a conversation around that. Because yes, we'll apply it sensitive to the local context, and we have in the past trained people to then deploy it. So quite happy to have that conversation. This is just drawing out some of the positive and negative, as I mentioned already. It's very much about providing a mirror. Relationships are very difficult to you sense that things aren't right. Earlier comments in the session. You sort of sense that things aren't quite right, but you can't put your finger on what it is. So providing that structure can sort of de-emotionalize. You're not saying that you don't like somebody necessarily. You might not like somebody, but actually in the practical delivery of work situations, you just need to uncover what it is that's making it difficult to work together. And this is a non-emotional way, I suppose, of doing that. In the CQC work, and this is where we asked a couple of supplementaries, and the top one here is interesting in that in this particular system, you've got the radar diagram again, and we asked the question, how long have you been in a system? And one might assume that the longer you've been in the system, the better your relationships. But in this case, it was the opposite. And that's an interesting question. I can't remember how the conversation went in terms of whether that was because there were some particular incidents that made people fall out a year ago. That's possible, but it unravels some or uncovers some of the story. And you saw the different providers. There's also quite a stark difference, as you can see, in terms of the difference in scores between organizations. And again, that's important. So from a apparently quite sort of average set of high level numbers, when you go into the detail, that's the place where you start to understand both difference between participants and partners, and also dissonance even within that in terms of what people's perceptions of behaviours are. So those are some of the ways in which we've applied the tool. That's an example, 2 or 3 examples. We're using it at the moment with ICBs in there through the LGA at the moment, but in other ways as well. And there you are. I did include some references at the end here. So there's a booklet which has more details. I don't know whether it's worth whether those can be accessed directly or that may need to be copied into the chat, but you'll receive a set of the slides. The top two there, in fact, the top three there are either links to our website and then on to the research or material on our website. Beyond Barriers is on CQC's own website and is the report that I've mentioned already. So 5 or so minutes left. There may be other comments and questions. Thank you for those that have come through already. Not always easy to be reading the slides or reflecting on the slides and checking the chat. So if I've missed anything, my apologies. So if you want to add something, then by all means raise your hand or turn your mic off. There's not so many people that you can't sort of directly interact.
Yes, thanks, Peter. So now's your chance to ask Peter any questions you may have. Just as we're coming towards the end as well of the session, just to mention that we will be putting a link to a feedback form in the chat for you to give some feedback. Obviously, we're always looking at ways that we can make our lunch and learns and webinars better. But yeah, now's your chance to ask a question.
So Marian's popped a comment in terms of the relationship with psychometric tools, and I'm not an expert in them, but I was obviously aware of and reflected a little in terms of the development of this tool. Psychometric tools can be focused on on an individual's, I suppose, capability or nature, characteristics, if you like, within a system, and they're important and they're relevant. I mentioned earlier the distinction between relational value, relational preparedness, if you like, and capability. So it's always good to think about how different tools relate and complement each other. I don't know FIRB specifically, but
yeah.
Do you want to comment on that, Marion?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's really interesting, and I can see sort of how this could be progressed in terms of working with, you know, system partners and getting them together. So the FIRB tool looks at sort of characteristics and attributes that affect people's behavior and how they behave with each other. So what would be interesting to me is of looking at that sort of baseline scoping work. And then it's the next steps about how can we actually bridge the gap where there are sort of gaps between integrity and all the other, you know, the 5 attributes. And I can really see that sort of working really well, because then it's almost like a gap analysis, but using a tool, you know, to as a framework for that, for improvement and change, the change the system wants.
Yeah.
So,
and it can feed back into an individual's personal development, in that if you are operating in a system and recognise certain behaviours, or you are a leader within the system, you know, leadership and modelling behaviours is critical. So feeding back into that mentoring role would be
because
really
it works on individual and on teams, and teams could be extrapolated to whatever the relevant grouping is. So I could really see that working really well together. Thank you. Very interesting.
Yep. Thank you, Natalie, for your comment as well. Yeah. If you want to unwrap that comment, Natalie, feel free, or leave it there in the chat.
No, I think it's definitely, I mean, when you identify where you are at, it's almost an evolution, isn't it? You will identify gaps, you will identify areas for improvement, and then what is it you can put in place? What is support package? What kind of support interventions you can put in place? Is it simply more kind of opportunities to spend time together, like more meetings, more face-to-face, more different things, or maybe there is something else that you can develop? So it's would be interesting to know what are that toolkit that will make difference and will help to improve the level of meaningful and effective relationship.
It can also point to ideas and thoughts that you've perhaps thought would be useful, but you haven't had the evidence for, if you like. The work that I'm doing at the moment is, there's been quite a bit of talk about co-location, which is something that's now co-location will help in providing the sort of
Yeah.
in overcoming some of the technical processy things about communicating, and that's a fundamental part. And when I've looked at some of the scoring in work that we're doing at the moment, that is a deficit. And I basically said, well, surely co-location, which you want to do anyway, should have a positive impact on something that is now sort of glaring us in the face as a poor area within the relational framework. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's all very interesting, actually. And I'm just wondering whether people wanted to express any interest in whether they'd be interested in a further session, because this session is called, obviously, Making Relationships Count, but making relationships work, you know, and actually, like you say, Natalie, the solutions that we're looking for, and whether that's something that would be of interest to people. If that is of interest, please pop it in the feedback form or in the chat today, and then we can pick that up and take that further.
I think it's something just to trigger ideas. Anything else, what, like almost examples of good practice, what worked elsewhere, or what something, you know, was put in place that actually helped to improve the relationship and make it more, you know, meet the highest scores within your charts.
Yeah. I mean, we were starting to build a portfolio, if you like, and a network of folk. Unfortunately, it sort of fell by the wayside during COVID, as you can probably realise. And people now, even though it's such an important area to refocus on, people are finding it difficult to devote the time to something that doesn't appear to be top of the priorities in terms of some.
Yeah. I think when you're speaking about relationship, naturally you think about the softer skills, individuals' softer skills. Somebody is more kind of extrovert, more kind of able to build quick and effective and trustworthy relationships, etc. And others more kind of, you know, just observing, etc., etc. But in a professional environment, it's such an integral part of it. It's actually such a kind of critical ability to make relationship in a business environment. So it's something that potentially has an ability to be taught, and you know, with a different, again, interventions and I don't know, creating the right space and right environment, maybe agreeing to you know, common principles of, you know, how we are approaching the business, etc., etc. That's something that should be taught and learned. Yeah.
And of course, if we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about the clinical workforce as well as the non-clinical workforce. So it's absolutely vital, isn't it? And all the pressures they're under. You know, you're talking about you know, agency workforce and all those other issues that can, you know, impact on relationships, you know, and create you know, dissonance or, you know, problems. So not necessarily agency, I didn't mean it to say like that, but there's all sorts of different problems and issues, aren't there, that can impact on relationships in the clinical workforce as well as the non-clinical and business workforce. Okay, so I can see. Thank you so much, everybody, for comments today. And I can see we've actually slightly gone over our time. So thank you so much for joining us. Big thank you to Peter, who's joined us yesterday and today. And really, you know, if you have any further questions you'd like to ask Peter, do pop them in the feedback form, and we'll forward them on to him and put you in touch with him so that he can, you know, if there's any sort of area that you wish to develop with him, it's something that he can respond to. Yeah, if you could just, you know, I have to say it was a really, really fascinating section for me, because, you know, it's not something, as you say, Peter, that sadly people don't think it's an important area to focus on, and for me I think it's actually a key area to focus on. You know, and I think everything else falls apart if you don't have good relationships. So thank you so much, and unless you want to add anything, we'll end it there.
Thank you.
Okay, and thanks everybody for joining us today, and we hope you join us on one of the other webinars that we mentioned at the start of this session, and take care.